And so the show goes on. Let's see.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for coming. Thank you, Jessica. Thank you, Jean. Thanks to the museum for having me. I'm going to hit my screen share just to see if I can get my PowerPoint up and running here. And I think there it is. Can someone give me the thumbs up if you can see? Thank you. So my topic today, the second part of this series is part 2, Revisionist Zionism. So, just to refresh people's memory, sort of my theme for this whole series is to talk about the ways in which Zionism really isn't any one thing. That I think very often people talk about Zionism as if it's a very coherent ideology, a very coherent movement. In historical reality, that's just not the case. That there have been as many different Zionisms as there has been Zionists, and that Zionism has been really, if it's any one thing, it's really a raucous and complicated debate that's been going on at this point for well over a century. And so what I wanted to do in this series is just to pick out a few of the most important strains of Zionism, each of which on their own are pretty complicated. We talked last week about labor Zionism. Labor Zionism, lots of different political parties that have been part of Israeli history, both before and after the founding of the State of Israel, were part of the labor movement. So even labor Zionism itself is not as coherent as the label might suggest. But we talked about labor Zionism last week, which was that movement was very, very vital in the establishment of the Jewish settlement in Palestine and the eventual founding of the State of Israel. This week, I'd like to talk about revisionist Zionism, which is undoubtedly the second most influential and second most important strain of Zionism in the early 20th century. Very, very foundational, very instrumental, both in the early settlement of Palestine and in the subsequent founding of the State of Israel. And for those of you who know about revisionist Zionism, my apologies if any of this is just repeating what you already know. For those of you who haven't heard of it, I hope this will be illuminating. I can guarantee you that all of you know more about revisionist Zionism, even perhaps than you may realize. That if you've never heard of revisionist Zionism before, you will recognize the face and story of many prominent revisionist Zionists that we'll eventually get to talking about. Revisionist Zionism, in the lead up to the founding of the State of Israel, it was the second most important sort of strain of Zionist activism. But in the years since, in recent decades, revisionist Zionism has eclipsed labor Zionism. Labor Zionism has dwindled in influence. Labor Zionist parties are still around, and labor Zionism remains a force in Israeli life, but revisionist Zionism is much more robust in the current political life of Israel in ways that I think I hope I'll be able to demonstrate. So if you're interested at all in Israeli politics and Israeli history, having a little bit of control or understanding of what revisionist Zionism is all about is very important. So let me see if I can get my PowerPoint to advance. So last month, I think I might have said last week, I'm sorry if I said that, but when we talked about labor Zionism, I focused a lot on David Ben-Gurion, and I'll talk a little bit more about him today. Focusing on Ben-Gurion is justified when one is talking about labor Zionism because he was such a prominent and important labor Zionist leader. In the case of revisionist Zionism, it's much more clear the central figure in revisionist Zionism is this man, Vladimir Yabutinsky. His nom de guerre was Zev Yabutinsky. His ideas, his activism was and remains the animating force of revisionist Zionism. You know, much of our discussion today is going to be centered on sort of puzzling out who he was, what his ideas were all about, and how his ideas and his activities influenced both the revisionist Zionist movement and sort of the whole Zionist movement, the founding of the State of Israel. You know, I think, if you recall, I referred to the stained glass window, which is in my synagogue, Congregation B'nai Israel in Rumson. And, you know, the way that I always sort of refer back to the stained glass window because it sort of encapsulates a very common understanding of the history of Zionism among many American Jews. And, you know, for those of you who read Hebrew, this pane with 3 Hebrew names on it, right? Weizmann, Herzl, and Ben-Gurion. This sort of, I think, it encapsulates sort of a basic understanding, which is that, you know, how do we get to the founding of the State of Israel, which I think is represented by this pane that I'm with the Yad Vashem Memorial? Well, it's through the activities of these 3 men. Vladimir Yabutinsky, if we could show him this window, he would be horrified. Right? You see, he died in 1940, but if you showed him this window, you know, he would be just aghast, and he would be mystified. I think you'd say, you put Ben-Gurion's name on a window with Herzl? I'm the one who was a follower of Herzl. I'm the one who was true to Herzl's vision all my life. You know, Ben-Gurion was no Herzlian. He was a phony Herzlian. We're going to talk, Ben-Gurion and Yabutinsky really, for most of their lives, did not get along. I think this would really, really upset him. And yet, you know, look for Yabutinsky's name. I haven't really done a test of this, but I would be willing to bet that there are no stained glass windows anywhere in any synagogue in America that commemorate his deeds, and for reasons that we'll talk about. So I refer to this because, again, if we're talking about the memory of the history of Zionism, Arthur Hertzberg's anthology is really kind of a milestone. You know, when he put his anthology together, he really brought together one of the best collections of the sources for the history of Zionism for the English-speaking world, and especially for the American reading public. And, you know, in his anthology, you know, he kind of danced around the whole subject of Vladimir Yabutinsky rather delicately. And I think it gives you a sense of, you know, the controversies that swirl around his legacy. So I'm just going to read the paragraph. This is, I think, the opening of the one, and you know, we're going to talk about Yabutinsky was a very, very prolific writer. And Hertzberg included only one piece of writing. It's not even a piece of writing by Yabutinsky. It's a transcript of Yabutinsky's testimony to the Peel Commission in 1937. And there's a reason why he included that, because, you know, Yabutinsky was speaking to British government officials. It was sort of the most sanitized version of Yabutinsky. Yabutinsky was being very, very polite to his British hosts. And so that's the one piece of testimony by Yabutinsky we get in Hertzberg's anthology. But this is a comment by Hertzberg himself. Vladimir Yabutinsky has been dead for almost 20 years. He's writing in 1959. And yet he remains the most controversial figure in Zionism. That was, and I think probably remains, true. No man in its entire history except Herzl was as adored by his disciples. That was true, and it remains true. No, the passion which his enemies hated him was unique. That was also true. I mean, as an example, Ben-Gurion was in the habit of calling Vladimir Yabutinsky Vladimir Hitler. So, I mean, if you can imagine, these two men were founding fathers, both of them founding fathers of the Israeli state. It's sort of like if Thomas Jefferson had been in the routine habit of calling George Washington to his face King George, right? That's the degree of animosity that existed between these men. His followers rallied to him as the Garibaldi of the Jewish Revolution. His foes reviled him as its would-be Mussolini. Obviously, he was an extraordinary man. Everything that Hertzberg says about Vladimir Yabutinsky is true. The comparisons to Garibaldi happened during his lifetime. The comparisons to Mussolini and Hitler happened during his lifetime, and including the fact that he was an extraordinary man. There's no denying he was an extraordinary man. Probably one of the most extraordinary individuals of the early 20th century. So, I mean, here, this is sort of an example of his influence. Here's the Yabutinsky you see is on the left. To his left, to the right of the picture, that man is the young Menachem Begin. So, you know, Menachem Begin, of course, became prime minister of Israel in 1977. He was one of Vladimir Yabutinsky's chief proteges. And, you know, Begin himself was the first revisionist prime minister of Israel. One of the reasons why Hertzberg is so circumspect in his discussion of Yabutinsky and revisionism here is that in 1959, it was impossible to foresee that a revisionist Zionist would ever become prime minister of Israel. And when it did happen, it shocked everyone. And it shocked them even more that Begin was the one who broke that barrier. But you can see, you know, he was a protege of Yabutinsky's. This is Yabutinsky's grave on Mount Herzl in Israel. So initially, because of Ben-Gurion's opposition, he was not interred on Mount Herzl. But after Ben-Gurion died, he was reinterred. He was originally buried in the United States, but he was reinterred on Mount Herzl among the founding fathers of the state of Israel. And, you know, leaders of the Israeli government routinely come and sort of pay homage to him. You know, there are yearly or twice yearly sometimes commemorations of Yabutinsky. This is Yitzhak Shamir. In 1990, he was the second revisionist prime minister after Menachem Begin. Here he is doing sort of an annual pilgrimage to Yabutinsky's grave. So prominent politicians in the revisionist movement come to Yabutinsky's grave regularly. You know, those of you who follow Israeli politics will recognize the man on the right-hand side of the picture here. That's Benjamin Netanyahu, recently prime minister, the longest serving prime minister. So here he is making a pilgrimage to Yabutinsky's grave. The man to his right is his father, Ben-Zion Netanyahu. Ben-Zion Netanyahu is a famous historian, wrote sort of the definitive history of the Spanish Inquisition. He got involved in Zionism as the private secretary of Vladimir Yabutinsky. And so it's through his association as Vladimir Yabutinsky's private secretary that the Netanyahus became, in effect, a revisionist Zionist dynasty. This is one of many similar images one can find on the web. Benjamin Netanyahu has given dozens of speeches standing in front of a large projected image of Vladimir Yabutinsky's face. So, I mean, just to give you an example, and this is a recent picture, this is from the last 10 years or so, that Yabutinsky, much more so, I would argue, than David Ben-Gurion. It's harder to find pictures of recent Israeli politicians standing in front of images of David Ben-Gurion. But it's very easy to find pictures of very prominent modern present-day Israeli politicians invoking Vladimir Yabutinsky's name, using his image. This is the Likud Party. So the Likud Party, there are several different political parties that are currently serving in the Israeli Knesset. that are part of the revisionist Zionist movement, the largest and most influential of which for some time has been the Likud Party. This is the Likud Party headquarters in Tel Aviv, which is named Yabutinsky Tower. It's one of the tallest buildings in this section of Tel Aviv, and it's named after Vladimir Yabutinsky. So, I mean, just to give you, I'm just giving people a sense. And again, forgive me, if you've heard of Vladimir Yabutinsky before, forgive me for droning on. But if you haven't heard of him, then this is sort of an indication of his legacy and his importance. So, for those of you who are interested in the reading that I did by way of preparing this lecture, I used a book by Mordechai Sareg. Mordechai Sareg was a veteran of the Irgun, which we're going to talk about, which was the armed force of the revisionist movement. After retiring from the Irgun, he edited a volume of Yabutinsky's political writings, the political and social philosophy of Zev Yabutinsky. This is one of the most robust collection of Yabutinsky's writings that you can find in English. It's very useful. It's hard to find Yabutinsky's writings, precisely because he was so controversial. It's easy to find them in Hebrew. It's hard to find them in English. I used a book by Hillel Harkin, who's an Israeli novelist and author, a beautiful writer. This book that he wrote, Yabutinsky: A Life. It's in the same series as the Ben-Gurion biography that I introduced you to last time. This is, I think, of all the biographies from this Yale series, Jewish Lives, that I read, this was the best. And if you're interested in sort of having a short, very readable primer into the early history of 20th century Zionism, this book by Hillel Harkin is really, really wonderful. Gil Troy, he is a scholar at McGill University. He updated Hertzberg's anthology, and I used, for preparing this lecture, I used his updated version. It's a very different book, and in many ways it doesn't really replace Hertzberg's. You kind of need Hertzberg's anthology still, but Troy's The Zionist Ideas is also an interesting read. This book is really wonderful, Origins of Israel by Kaplan and Pensler, two professors. One of them, I think, is at University of California. The other is at Toronto. But this Sources in Modern Jewish History, this has wonderful sources in it. It's got a couple of the only full text translations of some of Yabutinsky's speeches that I was able to track down. So here's the young Vladimir Yabutinsky. He was born and raised in the city of Odessa. He came from an upper middle class family. He had a good education, a blue ribbon education for its time. There were early indications of his talent and his precocity. He was sent overseas to study. He spent part of his young sort of educational life in Switzerland, part of it in Italy, became very worldly. He became a very, very talented writer, and really for much of his life, he was first and foremost a kind of literatus. He was a writer of really sort of outstanding talent. He didn't show any initial interest in Zionism. He was in Switzerland during the first Zionist Congress, and as far as we know, he didn't attend and didn't take any interest in attending. But in 1903, the Kishinev pogroms broke out. The Russo-Japanese War was underway. It was placing a great strain on the Russian imperial economy, and it led to anti-Jewish riots across the Russian Empire. But the riots really began in and around the area of Odessa, which was Yabutinsky's home. And this got him involved in Zionist politics. He became involved in organizing Jewish self-defense forces to defend against the pogroms. And this sort of converted him and made him a lifelong Zionist. He decided shortly after 1903 to sort of devote his literary talents to Zionism. He joined the staff of a journal called Razviet, which was based in St. Petersburg, which was an early Zionist publication. and he became one of the editorial board and writing staff of Razvia, the Dawn. It means the dawn. And he began writing journal articles and essays in support of the Zionist cause. You know, over the course of his life, he wore many, many hats. He was a political organizer of amazing energy, and he put together lots of different political organizations. This is him at the founding of the NZO, the New Zionist Organization, which he founded in 1935. This is the executive committee of the New Zion, but this was only one of many organizations that he helped organize. You see him at the very center of the picture there. He was a family man, loving husband to his wife Anya and his son Ari. In this respect, he compared better than his foe Ben-Gurion. Ben-Gurion was notorious for having lots of affairs and being something of an ambivalent parent. He was a military man. And you know, one of the key contributions that he made to the early Zionist movement, he intuited that the Ottoman Empire was going to lose World War I, and that the Zionists, who had already begun to settle in Palestine and who had made overtures to the Ottoman government, that they really should abandon the Ottoman cause and should plea for the support of the British Empire. And he and a comrade named Joseph Trumpeldor, who was a veteran of the Russian army who had fought during the Russo-Japanese War, they lobbied and persuaded the British to recruit and train groups of Jewish settlers in Palestine to serve in Jewish units in the British army that actually saw action against the Ottomans. And he was decorated for valor. And this became key. He's sometimes given credit for having founded the Haganah and the Israeli Defense Forces. That's not really true. The Haganah was later founded really as the armed wing of the labor movement. But he was among the earliest Zionists to sort of intuit that Zionism was not going to achieve any traction in the absence of some sort of military power. That Zionists were going to need to use military means to some degree to achieve their political ends. He was, like I said, a writer of extraordinary productivity. He wrote several novels over the course of his life and had them published. This novel, Die Fünf, The Five, this is a German edition that came out early on, but he wrote it in Russian. According to Hillel Harkin, who I trust because he's a obviously very talented writer, this novel, The Five, is one of the greatest novels written in Russian in the 20th century. And probably, you know, if he had done nothing as a Zionist, he probably would have been remembered as an outstanding Jewish writer of the 20th century, sort of along the lines of somebody like Bruno Schulz. Maybe not quite as famous as Franz Kafka, right? But he was a scholar. He was he was very much a loyal disciple of Theodor Herzl's, but in two respects, he departed from Herzl. He insisted that the Jewish state would have to be in Palestine. It couldn't really be anywhere else, where Herzl was very flexible on that score. He was ready to, Herzl was ready to put it in Uganda. But Yabutinsky, the other thing that he departed on Herzl, from Herzl on, was that he insisted that the language of this new Jewish state would have to be Hebrew. And Yabutinsky was a passionate promoter of the modernization and the revival of Hebrew as a living language. And to that end, he did reams of translations of world literature, poets like Dante and Omar Khayyam, into Hebrew. And he founded a publishing company explicitly for the purpose of publishing translations of world literature into Hebrew. This is another of the novels he wrote, a novel called Samson, which is a novelized account of the life of the prophet Samson from the Bible. You know, this is another sort of outstanding literary achievement. And I mentioned this specifically because it created a kind of intersection between Yabutinsky's life and my own that I was unaware of before sort of beginning to learn about him. When I was a young man, growing up in New York State in the 70s and early 80s, there was this broadcast on Channel 9, the 4:30 movie, which always used to be airing whenever I would get home from school. So I would watch the 4:30 movie pretty religiously. And one of the shows that would air almost every year, sometimes more than once a year, one of the movies was Samson and Delilah, which made a very profound impression on me as a young man. I felt compelled to go out and marry a woman who was the spitting image of Hedy Lamarr. It was, but if you watch that movie, when you watch the opening credits, you get to this pain. Screenplay by Lasky and Frank, from original treatments by Harold Lamb and Vladimir Yabutinsky. And evidently, Cecil B. DeMille had the movie in development for 20 years, that he had always had this ambition to do Samson and Delilah. One of the reasons that it remained in development for so long was that he was never satisfied with any of the screenplays that he was given. And at one point, he read Yabutinsky's novel, decided that Yabutinsky had solved certain dramatic problems that none of the other screenwriters he had encountered were able to solve. And he insisted that the studio buy the rights to Yabutinsky's novel, which they did. They cut Yabutinsky a check for $666, which Yabutinsky then plowed directly back. All of his political organizations were in the red, so he spent none of that money on himself. He signed it over to the new Zionist organization. But that's one of the reasons why you can now find Vladimir Yabutinsky's name on IMDb, the Internet Movie Database. What made Yabutinsky as a political thinker tick? And I'm just going to sort of walk through several of his sort of seminal political statements to sort of try to tease out, well, what is revisionist Zionism? What are they revising? So one of the first things that Yabutinsky insisted, liberalism will remain sacred to me as long as I live. So, Yabutinsky considered himself a liberal with a capital L. And I talked a little bit about this, I think, last time. Liberalism was this ideology coming out of the Enlightenment, that stressed democratic government, but beyond just democratic government, a government that guaranteed certain basic civil rights to all people. Yabutinsky, unlike the labor Zionists, Yabutinsky was an unreconstructed enthusiast for the Enlightenment. He was, and we'll see what that means. He was very much against socialism. Humanity is not progressing towards socialism. It is marching in the opposite direction. Therefore, if there is a class bearing the destiny of the future, which we, revisionist Zionists, we do not believe, for we believe in a nation above classes, it is we, the bourgeoisie, enemies of the police state, the standard bearers of individualism. So, for Yabutinsky, he rejected everything about Marxism. He had no truck with any. He's a class warfare. Zionism is not about waging a class war. Zionism is it's not about proletarianizing the Jew. He said, and he said, look, I am an unapologetic member of the bourgeoisie. If the bourgeoisie can't be a part of the Zionist revolution, then the Zionist revolution has to count me out. And that if that the Zionist revolution, he said, was perfectly sort of in sync with the liberal revolution, liberal with a capital L, meaning it was perfectly in sync with a revolution that would bring about democratic governance and civil rights for all. Democracy means freedom. Even if this is from an essay he wrote in 1938. So this is 2 years before he died. Democracy means freedom. Even a government of majority rule can negate freedom. And where there are no guarantees for freedom of the individual, there can be no democracy. These contradictions will have to be prevented. I added in those italics. The Jewish state will have to be such, ensuring that the minority will not be rendered defenseless.
Mm.
So, you know, where Yabutinsky was most in line with Herzl, you know, in this, remember I talked last time about this argument between Ahad Ha'am and Theodor Herzl. Ahad Ha'am said, you know, Theodor Herzl, are most concerned with the creation of a state. For you, Jewish state, the part of that equation that really matters is the state part. For me, the part of the equation that matters is the Jewish part. I want Zionism to be about a kind of spiritual revival of Jewish identity. Yabutinsky, you know, thoroughly agreed with Herzl that the important thing was the state, that we need to have a state. And for him, the state had to be a democratic state in all of the classically liberal senses. So, you know, what would make it a Jewish state was that there were going to be a majority of Jewish people there. You know, this is following Herzl's principles. But he said, these contradictions will have to be prevented, meaning if we're going to constitutionally have a state that preserves a Jewish majority, we are going to have to do something to guarantee the rights of the non-Jewish minority that lives there. And he understood that this represented problems and contradictions. You know, perhaps the tragedy of Yabutinsky's life was that he was fully aware of the paradoxes and contradictions at the heart of his own system of thought, at the heart of his own ideology. And he never really was able to resolve them. And they remain in many ways unresolved to this day. This is one of his most famous sort of metaphors. And this is part of his sort of struggle with the labor Zionist. He was militantly opposed to the labor Zionists all of his life. Shot nets. This is an image that he took out of Jewish scripture. Shot nets is a fabric made of mingled threads, half linen and half wool. Scripture strictly forbids wearing of such material. Since Zionism is today watered down, young people become leftists and seek socialist revolution and try to connect these aspirations to Zionism. The rescue of the Jewish people is no longer a goal in itself. It is only a means, a channel, an instrument. So, you know, what he's saying here is all of these goals of socialism are meaningless. They're incompatible with the goals of Zionism. Zionism is about one thing. It's about saving Jews from anti-Semitism. That was really for, you know, if you wanted to sum up in a word, what is it that Yabutinsky thought needed to be revised about Zionism? The revision he wanted was to see all of these aspirations to do something spiritual about Jewish identity, to change Jewish culture. All of that should be thrown out. What needs to be revised is that we have to understand that Zionism has one goal. It's to save Jews from anti-Semitism. And waging class war and redistributing wealth, if you're trying to mix those agendas with Zionism, you're wearing shot nets. You're trying to mix two things that scripture forbids you from mixing. Now, and don't get the wrong impression here. Yabutinsky was not a religious Jew. He was the farthest thing from it. He was absolutely secularized. But, you know, he wasn't above, for rhetorical purposes, taking something out of scripture. If fools tell me about the spiritual significance of Zionism, I am deaf to it. So this is, you know, again, any sort of cultural mission, spiritual mission, religious mission, Yabutinsky was having none of it. Zionism is the answer to the massacre of Jews. It is neither a moral consolation nor an intellectual exercise. So it was purely a kind of geopolitical movement. There were no spiritual or religious goals that he wanted to see mixed in with it. So to this end, he formed this union of revisionist Zionists. This is the charter of the Union of Revisionist Zionists from 1925. And this is a translation of part of that for the last 4 years, the Zionist organization have denied the aims and methods of political Zionism. They've been too focused on spiritual goals and other things, right? Against this doctrine, revisionism sets up an entirely different conception. The aim of Zionism is the creation of a Jewish commonwealth, that is, above all, a Jewish majority in Palestine. The struggle is, at the same time, for the inclusion of Transjordan within the frontiers of Palestine, the transformation of Palestine into the land of Israel. So this, and in this, Yabutinsky thought of himself as a complete Herzlian, that, the goal of Zionism was to create a Jewish majority state. And the one thing that he departed from Herzl in is he disagreed with Herzl. It has to be in Palestine. This was also at the core of revisionist ideology. This Jewish majority state would have to be in Palestine, and it would have to have certain borders. And these were the borders that he meant. So if you look, on the left-hand side is a scale map of the British mandate in Palestine. So World War I ends, the Ottoman Empire gets defeated, the League of Nations is formed, and the League of Nations grants a mandate to the British Empire to administer former Ottoman territories. And what the British do almost immediately is they divide their mandate into two parts. And they say, all right, from the west to the west of the Jordan River is what we're going to call Palestine, and to the east of the Jordan River. And it's true, this was kind of an artificial name, Transjordan. This is how we get the name of the country Jordan today, that everything beyond the Jordan River would be called the Transjordan. And these two districts were going to be administered separately. What Yabutinsky insisted was that the future state of Eretz Yisrael, and you can see it's in Hebrew here on this revisionist campaign poster, this revisionist political poster, Eretz Yisrael, the shape of it was going to have to encompass both Palestine and Transjordan. That was very key, very central to revisionist Zionist ideology, that the true shape of the state of Israel had to include both of these parts of the British mandate. What does Palestine mean? Palestine is a tract of land whose main geographical characteristic is that the Jordan River flows not along the border of this territory, but down the middle. Thus, the meaning of Zionism is not only the creation of a Jewish majority in Palestine, but the creation of room for millions in Palestine on both sides of the Jordan River. And so this is the key question. Why does Vladimir Yabutinsky insist, and his followers in many respects ever since have insisted, that these are the organic, natural, inevitable, and necessary boundaries of Israel? Yabutinsky would have sworn up and down, this has nothing to do with religion. It's not about religion. It's not about scripture, right? So what is it about? And this is from this testimony to the Peel Commission that that Hertzberg included in his anthology. So this is him speaking to the British. We have got to save millions, many millions. I do not know whether it is a question of rehousing 1/3 of the Jewish race, half of the Jewish race, or a quarter of the Jewish race. I do not know, but it is a question of millions. Naturally, if that process of evacuation is allowed to develop as it ought to be, Jews will become a majority in Palestine. So this was the basic position of Yabutinsky. And in this, in retrospect, he is prescient. He was prescient. He said, look, there are 8 million Jews in Europe. They must leave. They will not survive. Yabutinsky looked at the situation in Europe, 1937, Hitler is in power, the Nuremberg laws are coming into place. Yabutinsky looks at the situation in Europe even earlier than this. He had come to this conclusion. And he says, anti-Semitism is becoming ever more rampant, ever more lethal. Jews will not survive remaining in Europe. They must leave. So what do we, and the only way that they can be saved is if they can create a state in which they are the majority. So wherever they go, it has to have enough room to house 8 million of them. And that's why he says, this is what the shape of Israel has to be like. If we need room for 8 million Jews, and the math works out. Like if we move 8 million Jews into this area, and we add them to the people who live there right now, Jews will naturally be in the majority. Won't be a matter of violence, right? They will be in the majority, and we can construct a liberal state that will protect the rights of Jews, but will also protect the rights of the non-Jews who are already living there. So this is this is kind of, if we're giving Yabutinsky his best reading, if we're saying that he's true, we're reading him as being truest to his best values. This is kind of the best justification, or why he's remained so influential. In that, there was this logic and this prescient vision. When he said Jews have to leave Europe, Zionists were divided on that question, even as late as 1937. If you broadcast the message, Jews must leave Europe, you're in many ways, you're handing the game to the anti-Semites, because the anti-Semites are going to take that message and they're going to say, aha, we told you Jews were aliens. We told you that Jews really weren't members of us, of our group. They're ready to abandon us. They're ready to leave. So we were right about them all along. They're not really French. They're not really German. They're aliens. They're going. So, Zionist, even somebody like Chaim Weizmann, was reticent to tell Jews, oh, they have to leave. Yabutinsky was unequivocal, and he was, in this he was prescient. So now this is where we sort of, looking at everything I've told you thus far, you might well wonder, well, why is he such a controversial figure? And, in all honesty, given that, most American Jews have very little, have as little sympathy for socialism, at least today, have as little sympathy for socialism as Yabutinsky did. I think if you did one of these tests where you handed out people quizzes about their political beliefs and you fed it through a computer, and you determined, well, which of the early Zionist leaders do most American Jews most agree with? I think probably 8 out of 10 times, the answer would come out that they agree with Yabutinsky much more than they agree with somebody like Ben-Gurion, who was a Leninist, basically. So why is it that Yabutinsky is so controversial? And this is why. This is from his most inflammatory and his most sort of controversial writing. And this is sort of an object lesson. If you make your life as a writer, and especially if you're writing in politics, you will be remembered for the most inflammatory piece of writing that you wrote. And so this is this is really, and this is, I don't mean to oversell it. This is not the only piece of controversial writing that Yabutinsky produced, but it's exemplary of why he remains such a controversial figure. Our colonization should either stop or continue against the will of the native population. So here he's writing in 1923. So this is, at this point, there's a growing community of Jews in Palestine, but they're still in the minority. They're in the minority even to the west of the Jordan River. And, they're periodically being subjected to intimidation and violence from the local population. So our colonization should either stop or continue against the will of the native population, the Arabs. This is why it may continue and develop only under the protection of a force independent of the local population, an iron wall through which the local population cannot break. In this regard, there is no substantial difference between our militarists and our vegetarians. That's a kind of a weird image. Some prefer an iron wall of Jewish bayonets. Others prefer it to be made of Irish bayonets, in other words, the British Army. Yet all of us solicit the iron wall day and night. So he's saying, look, everybody wants to be protected from the Arabs who are against us. Some people say it can be the British Army who'll do that protecting. I insist it has to be a Jewish army, but we all want the iron wall. And, you know, there are a couple of implications of this so one of the institutions that Yabutinsky is very instrumental in founding is the Irgun. The Irgun, you know, the full name of the Irgun is the Irgun Tzvai Leumi. So the Irgun is a military force that exists in parallel to and alongside the Haganah. And the Irgun Tzvai Leumi, the name literally means the national army, the army of the national army of the army of what nation? The army of Israel. So here's an Irgun political poster, and it gives you an idea of sort of the concept behind this institution. The hand clutching the rifle is a soldier in the Irgun. The map behind him is the map of the nation that he's fighting for. If he's a member of the national army, which nation? It's the nation of Eretz Yisrael, which you can see includes both Israel and Jordan. And so the idea is that, you know, and this was very typical of nationalist messages throughout the 19th and 20th century. You know, this nation doesn't exist yet. It doesn't exist yet, but it has its own army. And what is that army going to do? It's going to keep fighting until the nation exists. And, you know, I'm not trying to editorialize about the message, but even Yabutinsky himself realized that there were disturbing or unsettling implications about this, right? If you have this iron wall, the function of the iron wall, let me here's from the same essay. This sort of gets to sort of the brass tacks. The English and Scottish were invariably people of highest moral pathos, who would not want to hurt a fly, let alone a redskin, and who earnestly believed that the prairie had enough room for the whites and for the reds. Yet the natives fought furiously. Culturally, they lag 300 years behind us. Spiritually, they have neither our endurance nor our willpower. But Palestinian Arabs will act that way. In other words, they will fight us as long as they retain at least a spark of hope. So what is the Iron Wall about? The Iron Wall is about destroying Arab hopes. And in fairness to Yabutinsky, what he makes this clear in the essay, the Iron Wall is a temporary solution. As long as this resistance is being met, you have to have the Iron Wall, the Irgun, the military force up, protecting the Jews from the Arabs, so that everyone who's inside of the Iron Wall is going to enjoy democracy, is going to enjoy rights. Everybody who's outside of the Iron Wall has to fend for themselves. And that will continue until when the Arabs finally give up hope. Then, all right, the Iron Wall can come down. We can all make peace. We can all come together. Everyone will enjoy equal rights. Everyone will enjoy democratic participation. But until, the Arabs cry uncle, they're held at bay. They're held outside the Iron Wall. And only the people who live inside of the Iron Wall get to enjoy the fruits of liberal democracy. That's one of the things that makes Yabutinsky controversial. The other thing is, look, if you read carefully here, he sounds like a racist. And the fact is that he kind of was a racist. He understood people's identity in racial terms. This whole idea that the Redskins, they're fighting the whites, are fighting the Reds, and the Palestinian, the Arabs are 300 years behind us. On the one hand, he's saying, he's saying to the Arabs, oh, we're going to live in peace with you and we're going to give you equal rights. But on the other hand, he's saying, you guys are 300 years behind us culturally, and probably, frankly, that's because you're racially our inferiors. This is sort of, it's these mixed messages that made Yabutinsky this is the reason why somebody like Ben-Gurion called Yabutinsky Vladimir Hitler. There were the other institutions that became very important, very central to revisionist Zionism. I'm not going to go on for too much longer. I do want to leave room for questions. Betar, they were a youth group. Betar was a pun. Betar was the name of the last fort that was occupied by Bar Kokhba during the Bar Kokhba rebellion. But it was also an allusion to Joseph Trumpeldor, Yabutinsky's comrade who had fallen in his fight against the Arabs. Brit Trumpeldor, the Covenant of Trumpeldor. This was the youth organization. And, it was very, very militant and very, very militarized. These are not Hitler Youth. These are members of Betar, right? And this kind of thing kind of freaked out a lot of people, even within the Zionist movement. And it was accompanied by sort of strange things that Yabutinsky himself said. Here's from an essay that he wrote in 1929 on militarism. The truth is that only war is ugly. Military life per se has many beautiful aspects that unfortunately are lacking in civilian life. Take a few hundred Jewish youths, dress them in uniform, march them in a perfect formation, all in lockstep like a machine. This is the essential difference between a mob and a nation. Jews lack this quality in all aspects of life, but an education that some dub militaristic can raise a better and healthier generation. So for all that Yabutinsky decried and sort of sneered at ideas that Zionism should be about a cultural revolution, should be about a spiritual revolution, he himself began to muck around in those questions. He began to talk about how, well, Jews as a people are going to have to change. They're going to have to become more militaristic in order to truly become a nation. And this made him sound a lot like other people who were writing in the 20s, and I sort of gave it up, this guy, Benito Mussolini. This is why he was compared to Mussolini. Fascist education is moral, physical, social, and military. It aims to create a complete and harmoniously developed human. You could sort of drop this into one of Yabutinsky's essays, and it wouldn't be this statement by Mussolini wouldn't be it wouldn't appear not at home. It would be the other thing that made Yabutinsky very controversial toward the very end of his life. As World War II approached and the British began to sort of come under intense pressure to make good on the promises made in documents like the Balfour Declaration, in the wake of one of the worst sort of outbreaks of Arab-Jewish violence in mandatory Palestine, this Peel Commission that Yabutinsky testified to, they proposed a partition plan. And you can see it was a very strange partition plan. The Jewish state here would have been blue. The Arab state would have been red. This gray zone would have been an international zone that would have, in effect, excluded the area of both Tel Aviv and Jerusalem from either the Arab or the Jewish state. This is a very strange partition plan. And, Yabutinsky opposed it vehemently. Ben-Gurion, interestingly, said, okay, let's do it, right? He said, we should go ahead, we should accept this partition plan. When Golda Meir asked him, well, what happens if 3 million Jews come here? We're not going to have enough room. He says, look, when 3 million Jews get here, we'll worry about that when it happens. If they're offering us a state now, take it. If our goal is a state, take what they're offering now. Yabutinsky, his position was, from the spiritual standpoint, the national home without its capital, its symbol of sublime prophecy, would turn the entire Zionist ideal into something to be ridiculed. So, for all that Yabutinsky proposed that his ultimate reasons were demographic, it was all just about having enough room to house the Jews that needed to be housed. He did have this kind of blood and soil nationalism concept that the Jewish state had certain historical, national, organic national boundaries. And that made him sound like this guy, Richard Walter Daré. He was a central ideologue of the Nazi Party. The concept of blood and soil gives us the moral right to take back as much land in the East as is necessary to establish a harmony between the body of our Volk and the geopolitical space. This is the idea that, the boundaries of nations are not arbitrary. There's this blood and soil tie. Certain land belongs to certain people. And that's kind of what Yabutinsky is pushing. That, no, we have to have the spiritual home, it has to be, right? And this was problematic. This was problematic and remains problematic to this day. So, all right, I've gone on much too long. I'm gonna skip over a lot of these things. Yabutinsky's legacy, and I failed to give you a birth date for Avigdor Lieberman here. He's a politician who's currently serving in the Israeli government. He's been a minister of defense. He formed a party which is not outside of the umbrella of the Likud Party, but claims to be a revisionist party. Here's an example of sort of some of the problematic legacy. The Israel Beitenu Party, and this is the party that Avigdor Lieberman formed, was founded by Avigdor Lieberman in 1999 as a national movement. This is from their website. With the clear vision to follow in the brave path of Zev Yabutinsky, the responsibility for primarily Arab areas such as al-Fam and the Triangle will be transferred to the Palestinian Authority. In parallel, Israel will officially annex Jewish areas in Judea and Samaria. Israel is our home, Palestine is theirs. If you pay close attention to what they're proposing here, this is a form of what would be called ethnic cleansing. What they're proposing is to take areas in Israel that are currently inhabited by Israeli Arabs, transfer them into the Palestinian Authority, which would in effect strip those people of their Israeli citizenship, so that areas where Jews are living now in the West Bank could then be added on. This is about preserving the Jewish majority in Israel by throwing certain populations out. And that, by any definition, that's what's called ethnic cleansing. This is sort of what the Serbs were and the Croats were trying to do in Bosnia-Herzegovina. So that's problematic. This is Benjamin Netanyahu. This is from 2019. So this is 3 years ago, just over 3 years ago. We are constantly defending ourselves. Yesterday, a terrorist from Gaza tried to attack Israel and was eliminated by our forces. This is the Iron Wall. You can see he gave this speech in front of a picture, deliberately evoking Yabutinsky and the subject of his most famous essay. This is problematic because, look, Yabutinsky meant the Iron Wall to be a temporary solution. The idea that we would still be talking about the Iron Wall in 2019, and he died in 1940 before the state of Israel was founded. So the idea that you would still be talking about the Iron Wall, more than 50 years after the founding of the state of Israel, that would have horrified Yabutinsky, at least if he was true to his principles. So, he was a complicated figure. He has a complicated legacy. And I've gone on much too long. So I'm going to stop there. I'm going to stop my screen share. And I welcome any questions that anyone has.
Okay. Can I just speak?
Sure.
This is wonderful. I loved everything that you said, although I hated a lot of things that you said. But but I mean, the history that you gave us is really wonderful. In my earlier ignorance, I always thought of Yabutinsky as the one who insisted that Hebrew be the language in Israel. And that's the only thing I really knew about him. And I guess he promoted that, and it came because of him, maybe, but it was just an idea. But he was such an idealist and so unrealistic. How can you have a place where a whole bunch of Jews live and there's no actual government, and there's nobody telling you what you can do and what you can't do? I mean, I'm disappointed, all that I know about Yabutinsky now.
Well, let me, Yabutinsky, I think, would have insisted that the Israeli state has to be very robust. He wanted a real government in Israel. I think he would approve of much of what he would. If you brought him to Israel today and showed him the operation of the Knesset and the courts and the Israeli Defense Forces, he would approve of all of it and find it all very satisfying, very gratifying. I think one thing that I in my rush to finish, I sort of failed. To me, that one of the big tragedies and one of the things that makes Yabutinsky's legacy so complicated is that, his vision, he dies in 1940. So his vision of what the boundaries of Israel should be is based on the idea that 8 million European Jews would move to Palestine. Those Jews don't exist anymore. 6 million of them were killed. So the dream of creating a Jewish majority in the ways that he proposed it would be created is gone, right? The Jewish majority cannot, you're not going to create it within the boundary of Israel west of the Jordan River, much less within this expanded Eretz Israel that includes Jordan, right? So that's perhaps the truly idealistic dimension of his vision that is unrealizable, and that his followers, in continuing to sort of follow his principles and promote the kind of militancy of his vision, that's really maybe where things become sort of tragically complicated.
He wouldn't like the Arab people, the Arab members of Knesset.
No, he would insist that they have to be there.
Oh.
He says liberalism is sacred to me.
Oh.
He would have insisted that Arabs have to have representation. He just would have said, well, you have to ensure that Jews are in a majority. And I think that the situation that we're in now, and I'll talk about this more in the final, is that, look, Jews are in the majority they're in the political majority west of the Jordan River because millions of them can't vote. That's why Jews are because millions of Arabs can't vote. The Arabs who are born on the West Bank, the Arabs who are born on the Gaza Strip and in East Jerusalem, none of them can vote for the Knesset. Therefore, Jews are in the majority. And that I think would disturb Yabutinsky. He would be like, look, you can't create a democratic majority by simply not giving people the vote.
Paul, was Jabotinsky, was Jabotinsky involved with the bombing at the Hotel David?
Well, he was dead by then.
He was dead by that, so he wasn't, okay. That frees him, okay.
No, but members of the Irgun I sort of cut out a lot of, he founded this group called the Irgun, which Begin commanded. And there were members of the Irgun who felt that the Irgun was too, they were a bunch of softies, that the Irgun wasn't fighting hard enough against the British. And they broke off under the command of this commander named Avram Stern. And they formed this group called the Lehi, sometimes called the Stern Gang. They were the ones who were principally responsible for the bombing of the King David Hotel. But they were followers of Yabutinsky's. But he had passed away by then.
Okay, thank you. When I was in the last few decades, my American Jewish friends and I definitely looked at Jabotinsky as being wrong, that he wanted to take the military aspects, and that there was more hope with the political. And so he was among my friends and I. We saw him as a sort of, not the enemy, but just taking the long road.
Well, you weren't alone, Gene. A lot of, Arthur Hertzberg is right. He was and remains among the most controversial figures in the early Zionist movement. I mean, you think about, one thing I didn't underscore when I read the text of the Iron Wall, when people call themselves anti-Zionist and when they make anti-Israeli sort of polemics, which I consider myself a Zionist, I don't hold with any of that, but when people do make anti-Zionist polemics, they say, well, Zionism is a form of colonialism. And that people who defend Israel are quick to say, well, that's ridiculous. Look at labor Zionism and Ben-Gurion. They were so anti-colonialist in their outlook. But, for all of his liberalism, Yabutinsky admits, I mean, he's a proud colonialist, right? He says Zionism is a form of colonialism. I mean, he means it in a certain way, maybe a different way than the anti-Zionists mean it. But, and the thing is that I think, I sympathize with Marilyn. Look, Yabutinsky, from the perspective of Jews, he really was an inspirational leader. And I'm not, and was an extraordinary person. And, probably the state of Israel would not have been founded but for his efforts. So, if one loves Israel, in a sense, one has to love Yabutinsky. But he is a very, very complicated figure with a very, very mixed legacy. And, if we want to sort through the politics of our current moment, we kind of have to be willing we have to be willing to confront his legacy and sort of own it, all of it, the good, the warts and all, right?
Any questions? Any other questions for today? Okay, well, if there's no
Well,
more.
I just make a
Oh, yeah.
comment. I'm sorry. If you want to read Rabbi Telushkin, he writes the books he wrote were Jewish values and Jewish history. And it's superb. It's really great. It's about 1,200 pages, 500 and 700, but read a page or two a day. It's worth the read.
Okey-doke.
Oh, great. Thank you. Well, thank you, Dr. Meyer. This was an informative program. We look forward to seeing you again in March. All right. Well,
Thank
take
you all
care.
for participating.